I guess that we can start. Thank you all for coming, accepting the invitation to be here. We are really happy that you are here. I will just have a small presentation of the ESRC seminar series on the new financial reality. Let me find it just here. So, this is our website at Young Business School. It's the theme of the project is we are three from KBS. That is Nicolas Boukatos, Silvia Stanescu, and me. And we cooperate with the Professor Marcus Delis from the University of Surrey, Professor Bedranka Delon from Fairfax Business School, and Professor Christophe Harlin from the University of Orléans. That is not here today, but Sylvain, his PhD student, came. So you already have the program of the first seminar series. The remaining ones, okay, let's see. Okay, the second one will be on liquidity risk and its impact on financial stability. It will be in May at the University of Surrey in Guildford, organized by Professor Delis. Then the third one will be on financial market linkages and volatility transmission, contagion, basically, and it is going to be organized by Professor Catelon in Nice, France, early July. The fourth seminar on risk measures is going to be in December in the University of Orléans, organized by Professor Christophe Harlin. We will send you emails and information on all these activities, and then we will have for 2016 the two final one, managing volatility with new instruments, that will be organized by Sylvia, and the last seminar, probably towards the last in 2016, from October to December, just finalizing. It will be a mini conferences on the mini conference on the many phases of risk, and it will bring all these topics together. We aim to have you all here, probably in Canterbury or in a convenient place in London, and have some special issues. We'll have to start planning this already. So thank you for coming. The first talk is Jerry Dwyer. He's here, ready for me to start the slideshow. Let me. Okay. So the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katerina. Obviously, I'm sure, like everybody else, I really appreciate being invited. So Katerina asked me to come and talk about, the financial crisis and regulation and the implications of the financial crisis for regulation. And so that's the way the title got set up. The way it ended up, it was focusing on really systemic risk and macroprudential regulation and how to think about it. And so this is related to research I've been doing, but it's really sort of goes beyond it a little bit. A lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about has been done with John Devereaux, who's at Queens, Jim Lothian, who's at Fordham, and Margarita St. Martin, who's at Carlos III. So they're not responsible for anything I say, obviously. That would really be unfair. They haven't even seen it. The question that I confronted a few years ago was, so what is systemic risk anyway? That is, I was at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta up till about 2.5 years ago. And people were throwing around the word systemic risk. People from the board were talking about it all the time. I had no idea what they were talking about, to be perfectly honest. I mean, you could say, well, it's risk to the system. Okay, that's a fancy word for I'm not quite sure what. And people use it like it means more than this. This is a version that came out of the G10 report on the consolidation of the financial system. And normally it wouldn't be good to read from a slide, I know. But I think I'm going to make enough comments that I won't really be reading it entirely. Systemic financial risk is the risk that an event will trigger a loss of economic value or confidence. Lots of things do that. Switzerland just did that to a lot of people in the Eurozone. In or attendant increases in uncertainty about a substantial portion of the financial system. Okay, that's pretty vague, but kind of get it. That's serious enough to quite probably have significant adverse effects on the real economy. I don't know, the part that really gets me is quite probably. It's like probably is too strong, so we'll say quite probably. That doesn't get me very far, I don't think. Ideally, what you'd really like to do is have risk be something like financial risk of holding a security or something, where you can measure it. You know, where it's a number, or at least a set of numbers if it's multivariate, arguably. This isn't even anywhere close to that. I'd have a hard time applying that and knowing whether it was going on. George Kaufman and Ken Scott actually came up with a different definition, which is the risk or probability of breakdown in an entire system as opposed to breakdowns in individual parts or components. You know, you run into a problem when you think about financial markets. Like when I was at the Fed during September of 2008, people would talk about the markets were locked up. You know, like there was no trades at all. That wasn't strictly true, and it depends on the price. So you start to get into question about if you want to take the word breakdown as like it all falls apart. No, it doesn't mean that, but it must mean serious distress. Although that's still vague. And then they suggest it's co-movements among the parts is suggested. So that's not entirely satisfactory either, I think. Here's a different one by a practitioner, actually, for the Pew Financial Trust. The risk of, some people I know actually would find this very appealing. The risk of a phase transition from one equilibrium to another, much less optimal equilibrium, characterized by multiple self-reinforcing feedback mechanisms, making it difficult to reverse. So basically, this is a mathematical description of a setup, is what it is. And so, in some ways, that might be more appealing, but it's at least more precise, but it's really kind of narrow, too. I sort of think this, even though it's imprecise, I sort of find that Kaufman's definition is the best one. That is, that when I think about the risk, the kind of risk that people are trying to regulate, I want to think about it as it's really risks of things falling apart. Serious difficulties that don't normally occur in the normal course of events. See, for example, the way I come at this actually is the following, because I've done research on historical banking, especially in the US. Is the thing is there were runs on banks. And so people would decide that would get concerned about whether the bank was going to be able to pay them what they promised them, so they'd go and take all their funds out, or a large part of it. So you'd have a run on the banks, and then that could spread across banks for good reasons, actually, and that created difficulties in the real economy. And it created difficulties for the banks, for sure. And this definition would cover that. I mean, what these definitions of systemic risk are trying to do is be broad. That is, they're trying to get beyond just saying, well, we're going to talk about banks. And people want to talk about financial markets, and it's much harder, you know. You don't have the same kind of very specific thing that you do when you're thinking about banking. And so, at least to me, this comes across as reasonable as a working definition, although it's certainly unmeasurable. Without being much more precise about what you're talking about. So macroprudential regulation, I'm sorry to start off with definitions, that sounds like a really boring way to start, I know. But the thing is we have to figure out what we're talking about. Macroprudential regulation got thrown around a lot at the Fed. I had no idea what they were talking about. And I still don't think I do. This is a paper by Claudio Barrio at the Vic for International Settlements, which is probably the best single piece. The objective of a macroprudential approach is to limit the risk of episodes of financial distress with significant losses in terms of the real output for the economy as a whole. This kind of maps to the definition of systemic risk. actually. You know, because it's talking about episodes of financial distress. Like a lot of people, he wants to have it turned back to if it affects real output, then it matters. I'm not going to, this is no focus of what I'm going to talk about, so I'm just going to mention it briefly as something to think about. So suppose that something happened that, for lack of a better word, caused a breakdown in the whole financial system, and everything stopped. Suppose, for the sake of argument, it had no effect on real GDP. Does that mean it doesn't matter? It seems to me the answer is no, it did matter, because financial transactions are real. That is, there's a tendency to treat the economy as if, well, you have the real economy and then you have the financial economy, and that's unreal. It doesn't really matter. I'm not so sure about that. So what Katerina wanted me to talk about was regulation and all of that. This definition and the way Dwyer wants to think about macroprudential regulation depends on your ability to forecast when crises will occur or not. Now, I know people are writing papers about forecasting crises and all of that, but I just want to mention that's a big issue, actually. One of the things I want to suggest right off the bat is anybody who really thinks about financial crises very generally starts to realize, well, there are different kinds of crises. There's banking crises. There are sovereign debt crises. There are foreign exchange crises. Rogoff and Ronhart want to talk about inflation crises. I'm not sure that qualifies. So there are all these different kinds of crises even that you want to think about when you start to think about it more precisely. A banking crisis is reasonably well defined. I mean, it's just losses at banks, the same order of magnitude as equity capital in the banking system. Now, how you would generalize this over to the financial system is not entirely obvious, actually. You don't want to say there's a crisis in the stock market if the value falls 20%. Well, I don't know, you might, but I wouldn't. Sovereign and FX crises are interesting, and they're going to motivate part of what I'm going to be talking about for the remaining time. The sovereign debt crises are government crises. I mean, who's going to regulate the sovereign to stop sovereign debt crises? FX crises are fixed exchange rate problems. The government did that too. All right. So when people talk about macroprudential regulation, sometimes I think of it as what we would call the fox guarding the hen house. There we go. You know, if we think about sovereign debt crisis, yesterday was a very entertaining day for some of us because it was a big election in Greece. I'm not sure entertaining is the right word. That's not very nice, but interesting. You know, that what you have is that you have a variety of things that have happened across various countries. This is Greece, all right? This is from Eurostat, so I assume these are the official numbers, so they don't include all the debt. They don't include the stuff that they paid to vary for a while. This goes back to 2000. And you can see it's gone up quite a bit, but then here's Italy, and they're just rolling along. Now, the other thing is countries have managed this very different. This green line down here is Ireland. So Ireland actually had, for this set of countries, in the Eurozone in the US, the lowest debt to GDP ratio of any of these countries. And what happened to them is a combination of things. This is the financial crisis. They decided to take on all the liabilities of the banks, which had big fiscal implications. And the recession blew a big hole in their budget, a third of their spending. So countries have managed this very differently. There's no reason to think they wouldn't manage macroprudential regulation very differently too. So let's think about banking crises. That's really what I'm going to focus on because we know more about them. What is a banking crisis? I know this is a lot of text. You'll be able to download all of this. Basically what it says is really the following. Is if most of the capital in the banking system disappears, we'll call that a banking crisis. If, to take the extreme, the government acquires, there are difficulties with the banks and the government acquires all the banks, we'll call that a banking crisis. What they were doing in this paper, Levine and Valencia, was trying to make it as precise as they could. I mean, the whole issue with all of this stuff about systemic risk is to try to make it as precise as you can. And the way to make it as precise as you can is that you have to be in a specific context. Like this context here is banking crises, and you have a shot at making it reasonably objective. It's still not going to be totally objective, in the sense that people are going to disagree about whether something really fits the definition or not. You know, because you end up with things like significant bank runs. Well, what's an insignificant bank run? How do you know? That appears here too. Significant guarantees put in place. Insignificant guarantees don't count. So I use that definition actually. So basically what I'm talking about here is in part is some stuff that I've done with John Devereux and to a lesser degree Scott Dwyer and Robert Murray, where we looked at banking crises. And part of what I'm going to talk about right now is, so how frequent are these things? You know, just what's the relative frequency? We looked at 21 countries, the major countries spread across all the continents in the world, literally, from 1870 to 2009. So we ended up with 2,950 annual observations. That doesn't divide exactly, because like Japan starts in 1901. There were 91 banking crises. Is that a lot or a little? You know, they don't happen every year. They don't happen every decade. They don't happen every quarter century necessarily. Data on real GDP and banking crises for 176 countries from 1970 to 2011. So here we got 7,300 observations and 150 banking crises. So these aren't happening every day either. There's no evidence they're becoming more frequent or less frequent as far as I know. I wouldn't want to push it either way. This is a graph of just real GDP per capita and banking crises for these countries for this really long period, to get an idea of the diversity of experience. That is, if we're going to regulate economies to try to stop these things, well, how often do they happen? They haven't been regulated before to prevent them, for sure. So this is Argentina. You can see they had several going all the way back. It's Argentina. What can we say? Australia, they've had a couple. Brazil, really quite a few. Canada, well, only 2. Chile, quite a few in the 1800s, not so much since. Colombia, only a few recently, actually. Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, 2. Italy, Japan, a few in the earlier period. Mexico, a few in the later period. Netherlands, kind of in the middle. Norway, in the middle on the end. Spain, 3, you know, not everyday events. Sweden, 5. Taiwan, 2. UK, 2 over this period. US, several, because of the banking system. And Venezuela, 2.
How are you defining banking crisis here?
Basically, this what I just did, the paper by Levin in Valencia. Actually, we used their data on banking crises.
So how do they define it?
That's the way they defined it.
No, so you took their events, or you went back through?
Oh, we took their events.
Just their events, but. Okay.
And they defined it this way. You know, and we looked at the ones they had, and as far as we know, they were roughly speaking the ones we would have. We might differ on a few things, but John actually knows more about the history than I do. John might differ on a few of them, but not in a significant way, and it doesn't really matter for the general point.
No, I was just curious because you said, I mean, there are ambiguous classification of what is a banking crisis, and you
Well, I think in the end, what you always end up, unless you're going to make it really, really rigid. I mean, you could make things that are completely non-judgmental, but then they'd be hard to implement, I think. Because this is going back to the 1870s. I mean, one of the troubles we run into, actually, because I ran into this in particular in a paper where I was looking at something that happened in 1855 in the U.S. I really wanted to go back to that town and be on the city streets that day.
The problem maybe can be identification in the environment. If you take up to the late 80s, you have the deregulation, after, when the deregulation, and the banks collapsed. So they collapsed because of deregulation, because the environment changed. But from 90s up to now, it was, the environment was different. So the causes, and it should be in some way treated in different way.
I see, I would interpret what you're saying this way. The question starts to become, well, what caused all of these?
Like in that,
How would you predict them in a serious way?
But
That's actually what John and I are doing right now. That's the way I would interpret your question.
I mean, we know that the current crisis was actually run on the wholesale money market. It wasn't a fact run in a classical sense. So with the introduction of deposit insurance, as we can see, the run on banks as a phenomena, at least in the Western OECD countries, didn't occur to the reason.
It did on Northern Rock.
And the Northern Rock being an
Shouldn't
exception,
say
of
that.
course, yeah. But generically, it was a very different crisis this time around than the previous sort of people queuing up to get their money out.
Okay, but you have to turn around and argue that it's much more common too. These are infrequent events. That's the major point I want to make. I mean, if you want to argue about what started the crisis, I can do that too.
Just a clarification about the definition. So is it a banking crisis because preceded by a sovereign crisis at the same time?
No.
So it's
That's not part of the definition at all. Actually, right now what we're observing, of course, is sovereign debt crises that are triggered by the banking problems. That was partly true in Ireland.
But you talked about Argentina, so I thought that might be the other way around.
I don't know enough about the Argentina crisis to know exactly what precipitated them.
So it doesn't matter. It's a banking crisis.
That isn't really, yeah. Well, the point I'm trying to suggest to you, and it's great if you think about other things too, is there are only 91 of those lines. All right? I'm not saying they don't matter. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying there aren't a lot of them. It's not like something that happens every 5 years, thank God. All right? I'm not saying they don't matter. So one of the things we want to do is well, if what we're worried about is effects on real GDP, then we should look at the effects on real GDP. And there are different ways of doing that. Part of the question that you have to address is, well, what do you mean by an effect on real GDP? Do you mean a decrease relative to trend? Do you mean an actual decrease in output? Do you mean a decrease in output per capita? That's what Reinhardt and Rogoff used, actually. So this is the discussion, what you'd like to have is quarterly data so that you could seriously talk about recessions. You can imagine a recession where you have a decline in real GDP in the fourth quarter. We have annual data. The decline in real GDP in the fourth quarter, a decline in the first quarter, and you don't see a decline in the annual data at all. Because by the time you get to the annual average for the second year, the decline is gone, and it's an increase. Not much, maybe, but it's still there. But nonetheless, what you end up with is if you want to think about recessions in annual data, the only thing that really keys with, I'll start with monthly data with the NBR, and then the move to quarterly data is you're going to look at declines in real GDP, or if you prefer, real GDP per capita. In the research we did in 2013, we used real GDP per capita, sort of trying to touch base with Reinhardt and Rogoff a little bit. It probably doesn't really matter, and recessions are really declines in output, not per capita. The one thing I do want to talk about is, it might seem, we're using something that's really simple. We're just looking at the decline in real GDP. Why don't we use something a little bit more substantial, like Levine and Vensia actually? Well, what they did was they looked at trend GDP growth. Okay, and that seems like, well, that might be a good idea. And so John looked at it, and for some things, some countries it produces pretty plausible results. This is a graph for the U.S. The recent financial crisis is the decline in real GDP. You get this decline. And actually, what you have is this trend is actually lower than the trend back here. You can see it on a graph of real GDP for the U.S. for 50 years. It's that big. Here's Ireland. Ireland was growing along really well, the Celtic Tiger, and then decline in real GDP, and then just almost flatlined since then. So there's a huge decrease. And it's very plausible for economies like that. But it's not plausible for all of these countries. See, what John did was he looked at countries that had big trend decreases, but actually no decrease in real GDP ever around the banking crisis. So real GDP actually didn't fall at all. That included Lebanon, Israel, Spain, Colombia, Swaziland, Turkey, Guinea-Bissau. These are all big output losses from their payments. So what do they look like? Here's an example. This is Lebanon. And so the banking crisis occurs here. And so there's a big output loss, 102% of 1 year's GDP due to the banking crisis. Admittedly, it's judgmental, but it's not obvious that there's any at all. That as real GDP goes up, it's not as fast growing as fast as it did back there, but it's not clear. Back here in the 70s, it was actually falling. There's a huge amount of variation. Here's Israel in 1977. So the trend that they have is this, and then this is the actual behavior of real GDP. This is a decrease in the trend growth rate of Israel, really due to the banking crisis. You actually get a following question in Venezuela. Venezuela had a banking crisis in 1978. Per capita real GDP in Venezuela is not as high now as it was in 1978, and it hasn't been in any year since. But due to the banking crisis, there's more things going on than that. And so, when you start to look across countries, with the, if you look at countries with modern economic growth, is what it's called, like the U.S. or Ireland, where things are reasonably stable, basically something like trend growth makes a lot of sense. You start to look at countries where things are very problematic, like Lebanon or even Israel, and it's not so clear. So, are these isolated cases? No, arguably. That is, what are the biggest output losses in their data? Kuwait. They don't really have consistent growth. There's no doubt their real GDP is going to fall with the oil price. Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Thailand, Jordan, Ireland, perhaps. The point is that even though it might seem really desirable to measure something like deviations from trend growth, it's actually problematic across a large set of countries. It's very difficult to do in a reliable way. And here's Kuwait. And this is straight up GDP, not GDP per capita. So a trend might make sense for the US or for Ireland or for most European countries, but it's going to be a lot harder to get a reliable estimate for most of the countries out of 150. And so I would argue you're actually better off if you just use real GDP straight up. If you have a decrease in the growth rate, it's going to be hard to do too much with that. And so you can just say, look, did they have a recession? Was there a decline in real GDP or not? And I'll look against that, because I think that's reasonably reliable. Modern economic growth is growth in GDP per capita. It's actually pretty rare when you look across the set of all countries, like if you look in Africa, for example. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And so what we've gone to in our more recent stuff is just using real GDP. So what's the association between banking crises and decreases in real GDP? The first paper, which is in 2013, was real GDP per capita. It wouldn't make a lot of difference if you used real GDP. So I did the numbers both ways, of course. So here we are. This is the year of banking crisis. This is the contraction in real GDP per capita in the same year. And the answer is, well, there was a decrease in real GDP per capita in the same year in 43 of the countries, but not in 48 of them. And then this is the years where there wasn't a banking crisis. Now, obviously, a problem here is, suppose you have a banking crisis in November. You could easily have an increase in real GDP per capita that year, because the only decline you'd have would be on the fourth quarter. It might not even be that big. So an obvious thing to do is look at the next year. And so what do we get? Well, 67 of the countries, when a banking crisis starts, have a decrease in real GDP per capita, but 24 of them don't, in either the same year or the year after. Well, maybe it's 2 years after. So we looked at 2 years after. The numbers don't really change very much. And in fact, what starts to happen is that you're getting to the point where, for the countries that don't have a banking crisis, half the time they have a decline in real GDP this year, next year, or the year after.
So you're only talking about cases where there's negative growth in the following year, but not cases where there's a decrease in growth. I mean,
correct.
In this sample, you could have a country say with 8% annual growth rate, and then the next year 0.5%, and then
You actually don't have that.
Well, I mean,
You could.
I'd have.
Agreed.
Okay, well, I mean, it's possible though.
No, what you do have, the closest you have to what you're talking about, I'm not saying that what you're talking about is not real, is in Taiwan, actually, they did have a banking crisis. Real GDP per capita was growing 8% a year and it went to 6. So it's not like it went to 0.5. Most of these countries are not growing 8% per year by a long shot.
I mean, predating.
See, you're trying to measure trend growth, and that's exactly what I'm suggesting we can't reliably do. That's the problem. For most of these countries, you can't reliably estimate trend growth. Even for the US, okay, the banking crisis is really an aberration. But even for the US, you can find people who disagree in serious ways and spend a lot of time crunching numbers about what potential GDP currently is. Because that's what you're trying to measure implicitly is potential GDP. And the fact is, even for a country with really good data, really good quarterly data, lots of data on inputs, it's hard to do.
I mean, in European sovereign debt crisis,
Okay,
in the financial crisis, I mean, from this, how many countries experienced negative growth afterwards? But I mean, more still.
No, more still do. No, I'm not saying there's no effect. Okay, I'm just saying there's no effect. This is a graph of the actual. These are densities estimated year by year. The growth rates of real GDP per capita around the start of banking crisis. And so this is year 0. This is the number 0 growth. This is year 0. That's year 1. Okay, they're clearly different than the rest of the years. 0 and 1. They're kernel densities, so you can't, there's no obvious way to really test it other than just look at it and say, look, these are all clustered around together. These two are different. That's year 0. That's year 1. It's still the case, though, when I look at this density, there's a lot of area that's not negative. Not so much in the year after the banking crisis, but the year after, of course. Here's a different way to get your. You want to ask a question? Okay, I got to get.
So can you really identify the banking crisis? Because if you take, for example, Congo in 4 years, between 94 or Burundi 94, 98, a lot of things happened. There is a coup. There were, when you associate the banking crisis, the control. There should be some control variables.
Nobody's done that. Good idea. I agree. We're working on that. That's something. That's a paper that hasn't been written.
Serra Sazena in American Economic Review, where they regress this crisis with debt crisis, with coup, independence, and to see how to control for that. Because to take a 4-year period for a country, a lot of things happen.
We'll talk about the paper you're talking about. But in general, I think it's still the case that, okay, if anybody's done this, nobody knows about it. What do we know about? Almost nobody. Here's the question you're asking, okay? The question you're asking really is as well, so does this mean that banking crises aren't associated with decreases in growth, or that I'm asserting that? Because you wouldn't believe it anyway. No, I'm not asserting that at all. This is actually a bootstrap distribution of the average growth rate across all of these countries in year 0 and year 1. All right, so this is a distribution of the mean growth rate across these countries the year after the banking crisis. This is 0. All right? There's still, for year 0, there's still a fair amount of space there, area underneath this, below 0, but most of it's off to the left. And if we look at year 1 and year 2, it's like there's virtually no area below 0. All right, so it's shifted to the left. Year 1 is shifted even further to the left. And so the average growth rate definitely declines after banking crises. I'm not asserting it doesn't. The only thing I'm suggesting is there isn't always a decrease in real GDP after a banking crisis, which to us was remarkable. Admittedly, we come to it with US priors. That is, from the point of view of the United States, anytime there's a banking crisis, it's been associated with recessions. I mean, even in the 1800s. So, this suggests there's more variety and experience after a banking crisis than you might think, which is related to what you're saying, which is you have other things that are happening, you have different policies in place. That's exactly what I'm saying.
You know the exact month of the beginning of the crisis?
I'd have to go back and look at their paper to know whether it has the month in it or not. I doubt it.
Because if you only have the
even
year.
even if they date it by the precise month, I'm not sure. In some cases, you probably could. See, like for the U.S. in the recent bank crisis, September 2008, no problem. I can date it down to the week.
But what is year 1? What is year 1 after the crisis if you don't know the precise date of the crisis? I mean,
I don't have to know what month it is. It's annual data.
Fine.
I have
That's
data
what I'm
that
saying.
runs. I have data that runs. GDP for the year is January through December.
Fine. This is what I'm saying. If there is a crisis starting in December of 2014, then year 1 is going to be 2015, right?
Correct.
But the same is going to happen if the crisis starts in January 2014. The next year 1 is going to be 2015.
Yeah.
Which is economically could be a long time for the
Yes.
economy even to recover, especially
Agreed.
if it is a small banking crisis.
Yeah. So how would you do it better?
No, I'm not saying that I have the solution to that, but I'm saying that
No,
this
it
can bias
introduces
the picture of the
variance.
economy.
It introduces variance. There's no question about it. I mean, the way I think about it personally is like year 0. Look, some of these crises happen in January, some of them happen in December. And they're gonna be at different points in this distribution. They're introducing variance. But it's uncontrollable variance unless you find reliable quarterly data for these countries, which doesn't exist and won't. Annual data is okay. You know, you don't get too carried away about it. No, it introduces variance. But there's no reason to think that it introduces variance in any way that really modifies the point I'm trying to make. So how about the data after 1970? Maybe that's different. So if we look at the year of the beginning of a recession after a banking crisis, 54 of them, 41 of them in the year after, 2 years after the crisis, 1, and then no recession after even 2 years after a crisis, 44 of the observations, almost a third. All right. Now that doesn't say they're not bad things. That's a different question. The question I'm asking is, do we observe these effects, and are they severe uniformly for all banking crises? And the answer is no.
Does it depend on the degree of governmental intervention?
Possibly.
Policy?
I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, in the U.S., the question is posed in terms of, suppose you didn't bail out AIG. What would happen? And people have very different points of view about this. I'm going to run out of time.
Yeah, we're almost
Yeah, we're almost there. There's a clock. No, I think that's a very interesting question. That's part of what we're working on. We'd be happy if other people worked on this question. I think it's a really big question, actually. I think the thing is that it's so easy to think about the financial crisis in 2008. Think about how adverse the effects were. To assume, and especially if you have a U.S. prior from banking crises in the U.S. before the Federal Reserve, is, well, banking crises are all bad. They're all horrible. They have huge effects on GDP. They're associated with severe recessions, which is true in the US. No, not always. Maybe sometimes because they're growing 8% and they go to 6%. That's possible. There are other explanations too. Maybe the policies that are put in place. Maybe that makes a big difference. I think those are really interesting questions. Absolutely. I don't pretend to have the answer. This is the distribution of real GDP growth in banking crises in the post-1970 data, shown a different way. Whoops. These are coming across as just little dots. Let's see. That really doesn't help me. Standing up here trying to think on my head. This is 5 years before, 4, 3, 2, 1. That's year 0, that's year 1. What you can see is look, this is the two-sided version of the density of output losses across countries, and this is the 75 to 25% range. This is 0 over here, okay? So what you can see is in terms of annual data, look, I mean, it's the data. In terms of annual data, you see some effect in year 0, and you really see much more in year afterwards, which is arguably not surprising. U.S. banking crises, I talked about a U.S. prior. Here's a U.S. prior. All of the banking crises are associated with decreases in real GDP. The worst ones are the 2 in this century. So the point I want to make, that I'm trying to make, is a lot of banking crises actually are associated with declines in real GDP. That's all I'm trying to say. Now, what's the implication of that? Well, maybe it's policy. Maybe it's other things. Maybe it's that your growth rate is 8% and it goes to 6. Is 2% bad? Well, it's worse than 0, but that's why the big difference. I think that's really interesting. And the answer is not entirely obvious. And I don't think it's going to be solved by me writing on paper, and that's going to be the answer to the question. I think it's going to take a while. See, the question this raises in my mind is, going back to this macroprudential regulation, is limit the risk of episodes of financial distress with significant losses in terms of real output for the economy as a whole. We don't even know what banking crises produce significant losses in real output. I would argue, let alone why. I'm personally very dubious that we can predict with any confidence when these relatively infrequent events will occur, as a matter of fact. It's tough. Okay, and I'm out of time. Basically what I was going to do was, I'll give you this summary. I was going to talk about macroprudential regulations. You can think about it in 2 different contexts. One of them is you can think about it sort of, this is a macroprudential. Discretionary regulation, where you just kind of look at it and do what you want. Another one is really rule-based regulation, where you just lay out rules and they follow the rules. Another way of thinking about strategies for regulating this is one is to try to anticipate what's going to happen, try to prevent banking crises. Another one is really just limit the cost on the rare occasion when they do happen. What you can do, and either one, you need to know things like, why the differences across countries and so forth. So that's what I was thinking.
I don't understand too much, because your point is to say that banking crisis has we don't know if it has an impact on output. It can be positive.
Oh, I didn't say that. It's negative.
It's negative?
It's negative on average.
On average, negative.
Absolutely.
Okay.
It's just that there's more variance than we would have guessed.
Okay. So if there is a lot of variance, perhaps we should not be very strict in terms of regulation.
Oh, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is I think we got to figure out why the variance is there. It would be really informative to know why there's so much variance across countries. Possibly it's because of policies. Different people in this room will come to different conclusions about what policies would produce different things. Maybe it's a big stimulus program. Maybe it's bailing out the banks. Maybe it's not bailing out the banks.
And to infer from that, there's macroprudential regulation that reduce the volatility of other countries. That's what you... And
What do
you want to reduce from that what caused the volatility. You want to reduce macroprudential efficiency policies. Because
I wouldn't say so.
No.
I mean, all I want to do, here's, yeah, okay, point one. There's a lot of variance across countries. We don't understand why, I think. I mean, we can come up with lots of suggestions, but it's not like several people have written papers, looked at this question, you know, some of them differ from others, but we know why the papers differ, you know, and there's some reason to have a reasonable posterior distribution, other than just, you know, very little based on data. Okay, macroprudential regulation, what I would suggest is that we don't know very much. If we don't know very much, we shouldn't do very much. That's generally a good idea. And so, you know, first of all, do no harm. You know, it would be easy to do a lot of harm here. These are infrequent events. It's not like they're going to happen every 5 years and we have to go out there, you know, and putting out fires all the time. The question is, you know, it's like somebody asked me, because I was sort of talking about this, they said, well, so is we're going to have another financial crisis? I said, sure. Probability 1. You know, in the next 2,000 years, I can't conceive of not having one. You know, unless we become North Korea. They're not going to have a financial crisis. What I was going to suggest in this part was that really, the more rule-based the regulation is, probably the better, because it's not really relying on doing the right thing just before a crisis when you don't really know when it's going to happen. And the other thing is that focusing on limiting the cost of any possible crises to make the system resilient to these problems so that it bounces back on its own, as opposed to trying to prevent them. That's sort of the message I get out of that, given how little we know. You know. Now maybe that's not the message that follows from it, but it's what I got out of it. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much for very nice presentation. Topic. Now, this is, you say you would prefer higher intervention in terms of regulation. For example, if you look at the higher capital requirement, what will happen? It can be easily counterproductive. What I mean, if you will impose higher capital requirements for the banks, shareholders will push and ask for a higher return. You would like to get a higher return. It is expensive. So indirectly, it will cause that the bank management will go into even riskier businesses because they will say we are backed by higher capital. So it can, at the end, can be counterproductive. So in my view, this whatever intervention is, you know, making on ensure 70s financial repression, it was something different. But we are trying to do the same in 21st century. We intervene too much to the sector, let them go, and it will be replaced.
I've obviously come across as very different than I really am. In the US, I'd be called a libertarian. Most of the time, the optimal amount of regulation, I think, is pretty much zero. No, what I'm arguing for here, I'm not necessarily arguing for more regulation. What I'm arguing is that if we want to think about changes we want to make based on what we know right now, what we want to do is try to make banking more resilient. Some rising, here's what I think is really a bottom line in terms of capital requirements. See, the capital requirements right now are risk-based. So basically what they do is they said, for example, sovereign debt, well, that's not risky at all. So you can buy all the Greek debt you want. Mortgages, that's the next less risky thing. Interesting, isn't it? You know, corporate loans, they're more risky. That's just riskier stuff. And so the amount of capital you held had depended on the amount of those kinds of loans you had. And I think that's a mistake. Because it's trying to create these big bins, and everybody's going to run to the end of the bin. Now you may be right that you can raise capital requirements too high, and then the banks will turn around and, they're going to adapt, whatever you do. Any regulation that happens, you're changing the relative prices the bank faces, and they're going to respond to them. Ideally, what you'd like to do is have a rough idea, at least, of what the banks are going to do, and whether it's what you want them to do. And mostly we're not at the point of knowing all those things, which makes it difficult. I'm not really arguing for more regulation, per se, at all. I mean, relative to most of the people I listen to anyway, I'm arguing for a whole lot less. I mean, the Federal Reserve conducts stress tests on a regular basis on banks in the United States. They're going to regulate insurance companies. There's all kinds of activities that are going on. And, you know, I think the paper we're going to have on insurance companies is interesting, but I don't think it's the final word either. And I think the question of why the variance and all the effects is really, that's like the big question to me. That was a little bit long-winded answer. Did I answer your question though?
Just a quick comment, I mean, because you said you have a lot of evidence to suggest, I mean, to be able to pinpoint, I mean, in what cases financial crisis might lead to a decrease in output, a banking crisis leads to a decrease in output of GDP within the nation. Most of the time it doesn't, sometimes it does, but I think...
No, most of the time it does.
If you look
like
at
2/3 of the cases it does. Most of the time it does.
Well, when we saw the numbers before, it seemed like a small amount compared to the total. But my point would be to possibly look at the converse. Is that we know there's a great deal of literature, both empirical and theoretical, that would suggest that the degree of financial intermediation that a country relies upon for credit allocation leads to greater growth. And so once you remove this channel of credit allocation, then of course you're going to have disruptions within the country. And so that's why you would see in the U.S. that most of these banking crises would result in drastic losses to output, where in a country, say, like the Congo, you might not, where they rely much more on a black market financial intermediation.
That's a hypothesis.
I mean,
that's
but this would certainly be something you should control for, the degree of financial intermediation.
I wouldn't think it's control for. I'd say it's an issue that we should try to resolve one way or the other. You could be right. You could be right.
But
you're making an empirical statement based on what you think the evidence might show.
What I think,
and then the point is what you want to do is look at the data and see if that comes through reliably or not. The answer is yes or no.
No, I'm simply saying that you're arguing that there's not a lot of research done on it, and I'm arguing that there is, but just in the converse direction. In the opposite direction, saying that, I mean, financial intermediation, the degree to which that nations rely on it, has a positive effect on growth. So when you remove that channel, then you remove the growth channel.
Yeah, but you're not removing it permanently.
Well, you're disrupting it. So it's natural.
But you don't know what the size of the effect is.
I mean,
it could be small. Wait, the size of the effect of a disruption could be large or it could be small.
Sure.
Okay.
Just
it might not be statistically reliable. I mean, that's why I'm saying it's an empirical question. Your prior is, it's going to be there. Somebody else's prior might be, it's not going to be there. Nobody's really looked that I know of directly.
One point of concurrence is that I've got a few like risk weights, neither do I. But the comment is about where would you regard the Japanese problem, you know, having their, you know, after a stock market crash, a house and home crash in the 90s, would you regard that as a banking crisis or is it something else?
Well, they did have a banking crisis. They have a bunch of zombie banks. They're the ones who generated Ed Kane using that name, I think.
Zombie banks.
Yeah. I mean, they have a bunch of banks that have basically been bankrupt, but they keep them operating, and that's not obviously an optimal strategy.
Would you do
and that's the sort of thing you can look at is, you know, do they close the insolvent banks or not?
So 2 decades of lack of GDP growth in Japan, how would that feature in your sampling?
Well, their real GDP is still higher than it was, and real GDP per capita is still higher than it was in 1990. I mean, it's just they're growing very slowly. I mean, they have other problems too. I mean, they've been raising taxes continually. They promised actually in the early 1990s to raise taxes as high as they had to be, perhaps as high as 50% of GDP or more to fund Social Security. And they're on the road to do that. You know, and they have a problem with the banks that they haven't really resolved. I mean, they have a variety of real issues, you know, issues that affect real GDP directly, in addition to the banking crisis. But their real GDP fell. as, you know, the real GDP now is higher. We regard the whole experience as a result of the banking crisis. It's hard to argue that, I mean, it depends on what you want to consider direct and indirect effects, right? I mean, it's like if something happens, then it causes something else to happen, then it causes something else to happen, then it causes something else to happen, you know, and so in some sense, the first one caused all of that, but it could be a pretty indirect. You know, it might well have happened anyway. So I wouldn't think that Japan's 20 years of solid behavior is due to the banking crisis per se, no. They have structural problems. I mean, real, you know, things that affect real GDP more directly. Whatever structural means, as opposed to non-structural.
So, I think we have time at the end of the open discussion, discuss any issues.
Yeah.
Right, that's great. So next